In the southern belly of Missouri, not far from where the map turned quiet and cell signals disappeared, lay the forgotten town of Elm Creek. Its silence was not the kind that soothed. It was the silence of decline, of boarded windows and rusting mailboxes. Time had passed it by like a car refusing to stop. Jake Randall lived on the last family farm in the area still held by its original name. He wasn't old enough to be called a relic, but close. His hands were thick and worn, shaped by decades of work that no longer paid. The land, once vibrant and alive with crops and voices, had gone slack. Fences had collapsed like tired knees, and wild grass had reclaimed entire corners of what used to be corn rows. His tractor coughed more than it moved. The well was shallow now. Debt, however, ran deep. Among the land's tired features lay something even older, a narrow dirt airstrip, carved between fields decades ago by Jake's uncle, a Korean War veteran who came home with more discipline than purpose. He had built it with care, imagining a day when small aircraft would come and go like birds between rows of golden corn. But dreams faded. The airstrip became just another line of scars across the land. The locals called it a joke. A story. A useless ribbon of dust in a county that had long since turned its back on imagination. Jake didn't argue with them. He hadn't flown a plane in years. He rarely left the property at all. He was nearly 60, unmarried, and lived alone in the house his grandfather had built. The house groaned when the wind pushed it. The porch leaned forward as though it, too, wanted to collapse. Inside, the walls were lined with faded photographs and old letters. A thermos sat on the table, still stained from yesterday's coffee. No one came to visit anymore. The landline rang only for bills. Midwest TerraCorp, a company with glass offices and no soul, had taken over nearly every farm in the county. Grain silos now stood where children once played. Storage facilities with cold, humming lights replaced fields. The corporation had knocked on Jake's door 5 times with offers that smelled like threats. He refused each one. The 6th time, they stopped asking. That was when the foreclosure notice arrived. The bank had already marked a date. Jake didn't bother opening most of the mail anymore. He knew what it said. That evening, the air turned strange. Clouds, thick as smoke, gathered overhead. The wind began to howl through the skeletons of the cornfield, bending the stalks like whispers through brittle bones. By nightfall, a storm had settled over Elm Creek with a vengeance. Lightning spidered across the sky, throwing white-hot veins through the clouds. The rain began to fall sideways, hammering the windows with cold fists. Jake sat at the kitchen table, the old radio crackling with interference. There was no reception. Just static and thunder. He had grown used to the sound of things falling apart. But this was different. A low rumble shook the ground. It was not thunder. Jake stood, his heart knocking unevenly in his chest. The sky opened for just a second, long enough for him to see it, huge, gray, impossible. A military aircraft, far larger than anything that should have been in these skies, was descending through the storm. The blinking lights on its wings flickered like distress flares. The roar was deafening, and the angle of descent was sharp. It should not have been able to land. And yet, it aimed for the strip. The old dirt runway, half overgrown, waterlogged, and forgotten, took the weight of a C-17 Globemaster. Its wheels hit the ground with a scream that split the night. Mud exploded beneath it. The strip buckled but held. The aircraft lurched and carved its way down the narrow track, every foot of ground a gamble. Jake watched from the porch as the beast of metal and momentum fought to stop before the tree lean. It stopped. Barely. The roar ceased, and the night held its breath. Then the ramp dropped. Military personnel, soaked to the bone and moving with urgency, poured out. They carried crates marked with the Red Cross, medical equipment. Their voices were swallowed by the storm, but their movements were practiced, fast. The boxes were loaded into waiting trucks that had somehow followed the aircraft in, headlights slicing through rain. The pilots didn't exit. They stayed at their stations, engines still warm, ready for instruction. The team worked as though time itself was wounded. Later, Jake learned that every airport in the region had shut down. Tornado warnings. Runway floods. Springfield Hospital was desperate for what the aircraft carried: ventilators, blood plasma, emergency supplies for a blackout zone. The military had combed through emergency coordinates, some dating back 50 years. In an old military archive, under a file tagged for auxiliary landings, a strip in Elm Creek had been listed. A strip built by a Korean War veteran. A strip no one thought existed anymore. Except it did. And it had held. Jake remained on the porch long after the men left, the plane a dark mass on the field behind him. The storm was dying. The ground steamed with rain. Something in the air had changed, not just the storm, but something older, deeper. As if the land had whispered, "I still matter." And perhaps, so did he. Morning broke gray and heavy, as if the storm had not entirely left but was resting just beyond the horizon. The sky sagged low with mist. Rain still dripped from the eaves of Jake Randall's farmhouse, and the fields glistened with soaked earth. The plane was still there, hulking and still, like a sleeping colossus. From the porch, Jake could see its steel belly darkened by mud, its wheels sunken slightly into the ground that had tried, and failed, to swallow it whole. He hadn't slept. Not really. The adrenaline of the night still thrummed beneath his skin, mixed with something else he hadn't felt in a long time, a strange sense of relevance. For years, Jake Randall had lived as though the world had forgotten him. But now, the world had landed, literally, in his backyard. By dawn, military trucks returned. Uniformed engineers and airmen stepped out with measuring tools, radios, and clipboards. They moved with speed but not panic, like people who had done this before but knew time was thin. A colonel, calm and methodical, introduced himself and explained the impossible in measured tones: the aircraft couldn't take off safely. Not without more runway. They needed to extend the strip. They needed permission. Jake listened in silence. His land had been all but lost. But he still held the deed. For now. He gave his answer with a nod. In minutes, the field behind the runway came alive. Bulldozers rolled in, chewing through a third of the cornfield without hesitation. Engineers surveyed the ground, mapped elevations, and marked the drainage ditch that needed to be filled. Every moment mattered. The sun was rising, and visibility would only last so long. They had one sh*T. Jake stood off to the side, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, watching as his crops, the last he might ever grow, were flattened without ceremony. He said nothing. Let them take it. The corn was never going to save him anyway. Word spread quickly. It started with a neighbor showing up in a dusty pickup, coffee in hand, jaw slack in disbelief. Then another. And another. Soon, a trickle became a crowd. Local pilots came with cameras. Retired veterans. Families with kids perched on shoulders. A few brought lawn chairs and coffee thermoses, murmuring that this was something worth seeing. Some just stood in silence, eyes fixed on the aircraft as if staring at a monument. The engineers worked through the morning, laying gravel, smoothing mud, reinforcing soft spots with sheets of metal and heavy matting. Every detail was checked twice. They worked like ants around a sleeping bear. By noon, the makeshift extension, imperfect but just long enough, was ready. Then came the sound again. The engines roared to life, building from a low growl to a scream that vibrated through rib cages. The pilots ran their checks. The crowd fell quiet. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Hats were removed. Some placed hands on their hearts without meaning to. It wasn't patriotism, it was awe. The C-17 rolled forward slowly at first, then gained speed, kicking up a wake of water and dust. The crowd held its collective breath. The wheels cut across the new extension, bouncing slightly over uneven spots. For a long moment, the plane seemed to resist the sky, its bulk too stubborn to lift. But just before the very end of the new stretch, just before disaster might have struck, the nose tilted upward. The body followed. The crowd gasped. And then it was flying. It cleared the final row of trees by inches. The engines howled one final time, and then the plane was gone, swallowed by clouds. The silence that followed was louder than the roar had been. For several seconds, no one moved. Then applause. A ripple at first. Then rising. People clapped like they were trying to hold on to something fleeting. Some cheered. Others wiped tears from their faces and didn't know why. Jake didn't clap. He just watched the sky for a little longer, hands resting on the back of a lawn chair someone had left behind. The sun had come out, slicing through the fog in rays that made the field shine. The ground where the plane had been now steamed lightly in the warmth. A few people approached him after. A man from the local radio station asked for a statement. A woman handed him a wrapped sandwich and said she had seen him on the news. Jake offered a polite nod, but words didn't come easily. They never had. As the crowd dispersed and the gravel settled, Jake stood alone in the mud, a man who had given away what he could no longer keep, and in doing so, had found that something deeper had remained. His farm was still under foreclosure. His debt still real. The corn was gone, crushed beneath military tread. But something in the air had shifted, and he felt it in his chest like an ember refusing to die. A place once deemed useless had become, for a brief moment, vital to the world. And Jake Randall, who had not mattered in a long time, had become part of something larger than himself. 3 days passed. The weather cleared. The ground dried. Jake Randall returned to his routines, or what was left of them. He repaired a hinge on the back barn door. He checked the fencing on the north pasture, though there were no animals left to contain. At night, he sat on the porch with a cold cup of coffee and stared at the place where the plane had stood, half expecting it to return like a dream unfinished. But it didn't. The sky remained still. The road remained quiet. Then, on the fourth morning, they came. 2 black SUVs rolled slowly up the long gravel driveway, tires crunching over stones, followed by a third vehicle, a government-plated sedan, its mirror finish catching the morning sun. Jake watched from the porch. He wasn't surprised. Men in suits didn't just drop by Elm Creek. Not without purpose. They stepped out in silence. 2 from the Air Force. 1 from FEMA. 1 man in civilian clothes but with a bearing that spoke of rank, broad shoulders, a clean haircut, and the unmistakable posture of someone who had stood in briefing rooms and battlefields alike. They didn't come with threats. They came with folders. Inside were maps, satellite photos, reports. The pages were marked with grids, elevations, runway vectors, and weather assessments. Jake listened as they explained the decision that had been made. The U.S. military had identified the strip on his property as a strategically valuable emergency landing site. The recent incident had exposed a regional gap in accessible airfields during severe weather. There was now policy interest in correcting that oversight. The Air Force, in coordination with FEMA and Homeland Security, was prepared to enter into a formal lease arrangement. Jake kept his face still as he flipped through the documents. Words like infrastructure improvements, federal partnership, and monthly stipend appeared throughout. But what stopped him, what made him lower the folder and glance up, was the figure at the bottom of the last page. The lease payment was more than generous. Enough to pay off the entire farm. Enough to buy back the acre he'd sold 5 years ago to cover medical bills. Enough to keep the name Randall from being erased from county land records. He asked them one question: would it still be his land? The man in the civilian suit answered without hesitation. Yes. The government would lease, not own. He would remain manager of the site. His name would stay on the deed. The airstrip would be modernized, but it would remain Randall property. Jake signed. 2 weeks later, the transformation began. Contractors arrived with equipment Jake had never seen before. Cement mixers. Grading vehicles. Lighting rigs. They worked from sunup to sundown, cutting through the land with precision. The dirt strip was reinforced with concrete and compacted gravel. A drainage system was installed to prevent flooding. Solar-powered lighting lined the edges of the new runway, casting a soft blue glow at night like veins in the earth. The old weather vane, his uncle's, long rusted and half-twisted, was removed and replaced with a digital weather station linked to regional air control. Fencing was installed, not to lock Jake out, but to secure the field. At the gate, a sign was hung. It was a simple black placard with white stenciled letters. Randall Field Emergency Facility. U.S. Department of Defense, Emergency Auxiliary Runway. EST 2025. Jake stood beneath it one evening as the contractors packed up for the day. The sign wasn't grand. It wasn't even large. But to him, it weighed more than any monument. His name, his family's name, was no longer tied only to fading deeds and unpaid bills. It had become part of something lasting. The bank closed his debt file that month. Not restructured. Not refinanced. Closed. The foreclosure proceedings were withdrawn. The final paperwork arrived in a thin envelope, marked resolved. No ceremony. No apologies. Just silence. Midwest TerraCorp stopped calling. Their last offer had been a thick envelope with a check enclosed. Jake had never opened it. He burned it in the stove on a quiet Sunday night while the wind whispered across the new runway. He found peace in small rituals. Repairing the fence posts the contractors had avoided. Cleaning the tools in the barn. Walking the length of the airstrip each morning with his dog tags under his shirt and a thermos in hand. He still drank the same bitter coffee, still lived in the same farmhouse with its creaky floorboards and drafty windows. But now, the silence around him had changed. It was no longer the silence of fading. It was the silence of purpose. Jake received letters, now. A senator's office sent a note of thanks. The county council proposed naming a nearby access road in his honor. A schoolteacher from the next town overwrote asking if she could bring her class to see the airstrip where the big plane landed. Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he hadn't responded yet. The suits came only once more, to finalize things. They stayed an hour. Shook hands. Took photos for the file. One man asked if Jake had ever flown before. Jake had nodded. He used to take his uncle's Cessna up, once a month, on cool autumn mornings. Back when the airstrip was just a dream carved from cornfield. That Cessna was long gone. But something bigger had landed. And in staying, it had lifted him too. The air in early spring carried the smell of damp soil and thawed gravel. A steady wind moved across the open fields of Elm Creek, bending the grass like fingers brushing through old memories. The corn hadn't yet been planted. The ground was still resting, healing from heavy machinery and colder months. But something had returned, something quieter than noise, louder than words. The plaque arrived first. It was delivered in a crate the size of a desk, polished bronze resting in a bed of straw. Jake opened it with the back of his hammer. The sun caught the lettering as he lifted the lid, casting a warm reflection against the porch boards. The words were simple. In recognition of the Randall family airstrip, whose legacy and sacrifice supported the mission of mercy. In the name of national readiness, rural partnership, and quiet service. United States Air Force. There was no ceremony scheduled. But that changed quickly. News had continued to ripple through the region. Small-town newspapers had run the story. Then state affiliates. Then a national outlet picked it up, Forgotten Farm, life-saving landing. A few weeks later, Jake's mailbox began to fill. Not with bills, but with letters. Handwritten ones. Emails printed and mailed by people who didn't know how else to reach him. Some came from veterans who had flown in C-17s and remembered landing zones improvised in war. Some came from widows whose sons or husbands were in Springfield Hospital that week and had lived because that cargo had arrived. Some came from farmers who saw in Jake not just survival, but a kind of quiet rebellion. He never asked for any of it. But it came anyway. And so the town organized a gathering. It wasn't a parade. Elm Creek didn't do parades. But it was something else. A field full of folding chairs, a flagpole repaired and repainted by local scouts, coffee served from thermoses lined up on plywood tables, and a rented podium placed at the center of the old gravel turnaround. The same C-17 returned. But this time, it came not in crisis, but ceremony. Its descent was smooth and sure. The ground, now paved and marked with proper signals, took its weight easily. It rolled to a stop, not with drama, but with precision. The engines powered down. The hatch opened. And a silence swept over the field again, this time reverent. Jake stood off to the side, not eager to be the center of attention. He wore the same jacket he had worn that night. His boots were clean, but old. He held the plaque under one arm, not like a trophy, but like something fragile. The mayor spoke briefly, followed by a military commander. Neither offered grand speeches. They simply spoke of stewardship, of legacy, of the kind of patriotism that comes without a flag waving in the wind. Then the commander stepped aside, and a young woman approached the microphone. She wore hospital scrubs beneath her coat, and her hand shook slightly as she unfolded a piece of paper. She introduced herself as a nurse from Springfield General. Then she spoke of a child, her nephew, whose lungs had collapsed during the blackout. The ventilator flown in on the C-17 had been one of the first to arrive. He had survived. She looked at Jake, then turned to the audience, and said she didn't believe in coincidences anymore. There was no applause. Just stillness. After the ceremony, people gathered around the strip, walking its edges like it was sacred ground. Children pointed at the plane, faces wide with wonder. A few reporters took photos, but didn't ask many questions. It didn't feel like the kind of story you could reduce to sound bites. Jake stood by the gate as people passed through. Some nodded. Some stopped to thank him. One old man offered him a war coin, pressed into his palm without a word. Jake felt its weight, cool, solid, and deeply personal. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't have to. The sun began to set, painting the sky in ribbons of orange and blue. The crowd thinned. The last truck rolled out. The plane prepared to lift off once more, its second flight from Randall Field now properly logged in federal systems. Its engines hummed, then roared, and the sky reclaimed it. Jake remained, long after the dust settled. He looked across the field. The corn would be planted again this year, though smaller in scale. The farmhouse still leaned slightly to one side, but it would be repaired. A local contractor had offered to patch the roof for free. Said it was the least he could do. Jake didn't expect the attention to last. The world moved quickly. But something permanent had been placed into the soil, not a monument of stone, but one of meaning. And not for him, really. For what his uncle had built. For what had been preserved through stubbornness. For the idea that sometimes it takes a quiet act of decency to anchor 1,000 louder things. As night fell, Jake sat on the porch with his thermos. He didn't need to look at the runway anymore. He just needed to remember that when everything else seemed forgotten, kindness had found a way back. And stayed.